So, to kick things off, I'd like to paint a relatively coarse portrait of the BP oil spill for you using relatively broad brushstrokes. When I got the call from Andrew with the invitation to come to PopTech, I first had to step back and ask, what is PopTech? Because I, as a scientist, haven't been exposed to this culture and this kind of event before. And I looked into it and I thought, wow, this is very cool. Very much excited to be here, very much enthusiastic about having the opportunity to share some of the experiences that I've had working with folks on the ground from day one of the BP oil spill to present day. I thought I'd start off by saying perhaps this isn't the most brilliant of accidents, but it certainly is probably one of the brightest, where we have something that really captures people's attention very quickly, whether we're talking about explosions on an oil rig or we're talking about plumes of oil that are coming out in billowing form from the blown wellhead. So coming to New Orleans in 2007, I fell into a culture of resiliency and rebuilding and renewing. Certainly I was one among many individuals who joined the post-Katrina community in New Orleans, and going there, I realized that the culture of response and resiliency predated Katrina, certainly predates the BP oil spill. And a very quick history lesson, really to again, give you a sense of the context. You have to push the envelope back actually more than a century, but I won't go into the details of this. I really just want to give you a sense of the kinds of experiences and the kinds of events that define the Gulf Coast and define New Orleans in particular as perhaps a microcosm of the broader experience of living on the Gulf. So we certainly have the BP oil spill in 2010. We have Katrina, which undoubtedly you all are familiar with, in 2005. Predating Katrina, we have Hurricane Betsy. And if you note, the pictures of 1965 and 2005 are very, very similar. And so the question comes, what kinds of breakthroughs perhaps happened after Betsy that informed response to Katrina? I'll get to that later in my talk. But if you push back even further, we see that there are events in 1927 with the Mississippi flood that in many ways set the stage for what we're dealing with today in 2010. So being in New Orleans, I very quickly realized that the area was really a natural laboratory for understanding and studying failure and resiliency, understanding it not just in terms of what's happening today, but in terms of legacy and in terms of how these events unfold and are connected over time and space. So today I'll focus on 2010, but I hope to touch on certainly Katrina, and I'll sort of contextualize it even further with bringing back Hurricane Betsy and the flood in 1927. So when we think about a natural laboratory, oftentimes we focus on one singular event or one singular kind of event. With New Orleans and with the Gulf Coast, we have the opportunity to evaluate a range of conditions and a range of outcomes. We can talk about floods, we can talk about storms, we certainly can talk about climate change within the context of storms, and even broader within the context of relative sea level rise. And most recently, we can talk about energy extraction and, broadly speaking, resource extraction. And again, the benefit of being in the Gulf is that we can relate these kinds of events to one another in a way that informs our understanding not just of the natural world. Being an ecologist and being a biologist, I tend to gravitate towards those topics. But again, in a context of life in the Gulf and life in New Orleans in particular, it demands a broader perspective. And so I certainly can bring to bear my expertise as an ecologist, but I have to have conversations with people across the table in public health, in the legal realm, in medical health, and in sociology. And being able to bring all these things together is a challenge, but even just having that conversation is a challenge. Undoubtedly, all of you are familiar with that. And in New Orleans, it has really starting to pay off. So we can certainly relate the benefit of having one of the most bountiful ecosystems on our doorstep. So all of the natural resources that reside in the Mississippi River Delta, and we can see how that relates back to the built environment, where you can see the Mississippi River Delta is really, again, at the doorstep of New Orleans and of the built communities, how the natural environment relates back to socioeconomy and certainly culture, which is one of the many defining features of the region. So when we think about brilliant accidents, necessary failures, the term necessarily failure, we think about it in sort of the next step, what comes from that failure. In the context of the BP oil spill, I thought about this term and whether or not it was necessary. In many respects, it's a tragedy, and I think all of us understand that there was loss of life, and so it's difficult to make light of the context of the events. We certainly know that the event has not just involved loss of life, but loss of income and great disturbance to local communities. And so again, as a scientist, I approach this with an understanding that when evaluating the event, we talk about it not just in the technical detail of perhaps what went wrong or what went right, but we talk about it within the societal dimensions of what we can learn and how we can grow from what we understand. So there's a litany of things that I can say that went wrong with the BP oil spill and the events that followed, and I just want to sort of go through some of these things categorically to set the stage for some of the developments that are occurring, some of the breakthroughs perhaps that could unfold from here on out. So we can start with operational failure. So it's very well understood that from an engineering perspective, the drilling practices that were used prior to the wellhead blowout were inappropriate, and sort of leave it at that. I'm not an engineer. I talk a lot to engineers to understand what went wrong, but essentially it was understood that what should have happened did not happen from a drilling practices perspective. From an organizational perspective, the conversations about drilling practices are not just within the context of the technical details. Much of the conversations that have been happening about what went wrong from a management perspective, what was the culture at BP like that allowed drilling practices to continue when it was very well understood that the drilling practices that were being used were inappropriate. And lastly, from a technological perspective, there were certain failures. There were dramatic failures. So the blowout preventer in particular has captured people's attention. It's a very, very large instrument. It failed. Its fail-safes failed. And that, again, sets the stage for some of the additional failures that occurred post-blowout. And so from, again, my perspective, I'm an academic. I have experience working in federal agencies. I have the benefit of not necessarily standing on the sidelines, but looking on and evaluating events as they unfold and guiding and advising federal and state agencies when things are perhaps shifting in a way that don't make a whole lot of sense. Unfortunately, our ability as academics is sometimes constrained, and in a situation where events are unfolding very rapidly and when there's immediate pressure to take action, advice isn't often listened to. And certainly there are situations from a federal perspective where operationally there was concern about coordination, who was doing what on the ground at any given time. There was, over the course of the response effort, there were over 47,000 people involved, so a small city. And when the question comes up, who's in charge, it's a difficult answer to get. And that question came up time and time again because some of those 47,000 people were volunteers that weren't tied into the institutional response effort. Some of those folks were involved with BP, some of them were contractors, some of them were federal government officials and workers. And so coordination was a major problem and a difficulty as the events unfolded. From an organizational perspective, again, this question of who's in charge, that comes up time and time again. The question has been posed by witnesses in Congress and in the Senate hearings about how perhaps the events could have been handled better. And I'm not a person to comment too much on that, but it's a question about how we're prepared for these kinds of events, not just from a corporate perspective of how well BP managed themselves, but from a federal and a government perspective of whose responsibilities, where those responsibilities lie. So lastly, and this is where most of my time was really invested, was technological failures, and in particular, the toolkits that were available for the response effort. And I've portrayed three images here because these have drawn a lot of interest. The first is of dispersants being applied to a surface slick. The second is of generally referred to as failed boom. And the third is the sand berms that were being built and unfortunately are still being built off the coast of Louisiana. There were concerns across all three of these platforms, but these were the platforms, perhaps not the sand berm idea, but these are the platforms that were available at the time that the spill happened. And it's an important point to make because these platforms are tried and true technologies. They've been evaluated, they've been tested, they've been demonstrated in prior events. Some of these platforms do well under certain circumstances, and some of them have questionable outcomes when they're applied to different circumstances. Sort of again, as the disaster unfolded, dispersants became used extensively in environments physically that they were not designed for. And so when we think about toolkits and technological failures and the repercussions of perhaps not having the toolkit that we would so desire, we have to rely on the things that are available. We have to make best use of them and perhaps novel use of them and understand that there are potential consequences. Sometimes, though, you make the decision not to do anything and to not pursue perhaps novel uses. I was part of a review with the US EPA. We were tasked with the question, do we try to augment microbial populations with the idea that we can stimulate them and we can improve their performance upon exposure to oil? And what we found with a review of the available information was that we simply didn't have the confidence to go forward with a recommendation that it was a good idea to do anything. And so rather than try and invent something new or come up with a novel application, we just said, it's not worth it. Let's just not do anything. So there certainly are detailed technical failures and difficulties that came up, but I think the thing that I'd like to spend the most time on is the idea that there were conceptual failures. And the conceptual failures, again, from a historical perspective, we have to look back on some of prior oil spills that informed us in terms of how we portray or how we evaluated the BP oil spill. And the three that often come to mind and were often referred to most is the Exxon Valdez event, the Ixtoc-1 event, and the Santa Barbara oil spill in 1969. Each of those occurred in shallow water conditions. And it's an important point to make and often lost that shallow water conditions are very different than deep water conditions. And so the lessons that we learn from shallow water spills or from a well blowout like Ixtoc-1 perhaps don't apply. And the thing that I often refer to for folks that understand this is at the beginning of the spill, when people were trying to get a sense of what that three-dimensionality involved, we would see pictures like this. This is a graphic from the New York Times where we see oil coming up to the surface. Now, that makes sense, right? So oil is less dense than water. It should all come up to the surface. Nothing should stay entrained in the water column. But what we came to understand, in fact, which is something that was very well understood from a mechanical engineering perspective, plume formation from blown out wellheads at deep water has been actually very well studied. But those lessons didn't translate to the response effort very well until it was demonstrated empirically that underwater plumes existed and perhaps still exist. This is some work that was done by Chris Reddy at Woods Hole, which has since been validated and demonstrated repeatedly by folks at University of Georgia and by University of South Florida, showing the presence of plumes at a depth that was consistent with simulation models in plume formation. So we started with perhaps a flawed conceptual model where we expected the oil to perform as it performs in shallow water conditions where everything comes up to the surface, nothing gets entrained. Really, that just gives us a sense that we perhaps don't know what's going on or fully understand the circumstances that were as they were unfolding. So the question that comes to mind is we're now several months after the wellhead has been killed, and recovery efforts are ongoing. And they will be ongoing for perhaps years, if not decades, to come. From a failure perspective, do we continue to employ the conceptual model that has been developed from prior events, or do we develop something new? From a pragmatic perspective, we have to do a little bit of both, right? So there are these ongoing efforts. We're locked into certain policies and legal frameworks like the natural resource damage assessment that require us to take tallies and measures of effect. For example, how many birds are oiled or how many birds died in response to being oiled. But there are other questions that come up that aren't necessarily being addressed and certainly aren't being incorporated into efforts like the NRDA. One thing as a coastal ecologist I often remind people of is the importance of just simply the extent of coastal marsh in the Mississippi River Delta. The marshes there serve essential functions. They provide ecosystem services that translate to real dollars in fishery productivity, for example. And we have major issues of erosion and loss of coastal marsh that well predate the BP oil event. The question is do we see an acceleration of loss due to oiling? And that kind of dynamic isn't being captured in the frameworks and the legal aspects of ongoing efforts thus far. And so we're left with this question of how do we go from where we are now to potentially where we need to be going? So again, putting this into a broader context, we certainly need to evaluate it from an ecological perspective. We need to get a sense of an overall biological impact of the event, but this needs to be translated into real terms. And again, with respect to the Mississippi River Delta, it's relatively straightforward to do. The well-being of oysters, that oysters provide a platform for a broader ecosystem within the area. If we lose oysters, we lose the ecosystem, but we also lose that fishery. Similarly, we can say the same for shrimp and blue crab. So we think about breakthroughs. As these events are unfolding, and they are unfolding, and they will be unfolding for quite some time, we certainly will see operations improving. We'll certainly see technology improving. And my greatest hope is that we'll see science improving. We've learned lessons from previous spills. There's no reason to think that our understanding of the science won't improve with the BP oil spill. So as an ecologist, I often think about how ecology is done. And this point has been made several times already at the conference, that there's this tendency to think about inside and outside, nature preserves versus cities. And this is well portrayed in this image. This is a boundary at the extent of New Orleans where the built environment transfers very quickly to the natural environment. But if you portray that same perspective from perhaps a slightly different light, you stop seeing that boundary. So we see a gradual transition from the urban environment to the wetlands that surround it. And this idea of contrast versus coupling really needs to be taken to heart at a very fundamental level. So the point again was made in a conservation perspective, an applied sciences perspective, that there are benefits to taking a broad perspective. But from an ecologist's perspective, we have to stop seeing things like this, where we see plant distributions, to perhaps this, where we see the same extent, the same geography, but we see where the pipelines lie below the surfaces of the marshes. So again, thinking about perspective and approach, as an ecologist, we know that nature exists. We have these nature preserves, but we should stop gravitating towards situations like this because we know that those nature preserves are in a broader context of effect and response. And really, our understanding of natural responses to human interventions or modifications are going to give us a much broader understanding of the risks that are posed by events like the BP oil spill and really get a sense of resiliency, not just within the context of cultural or societal resiliency, but how natural resiliency and socioeconomic resiliency are coupled. What are the kinds of services that we need to improve the resiliency of cities and communities? So again, thinking about this, we certainly have a broad perspective in New Orleans that stretches back over a century. And we need to shift our perspective from contrasts to couplings, from built environment to natural environment. And thinking about this in terms of what's at stake, within 1 or 2 generations, the expectation is that we will lose most, if not all, of the Mississippi River Delta. And the question is will we see things like this where we'll have a future of decline or whether we'll have a future of celebration? With that, I'll end.